we have three fantastic speakers. This is a session on market power and dynamics in pharmaceuticals, which I'm really looking forward to because I don't know much about it. So without ado, we're not doing big introductions, so I'm going to introduce Margaret Kyle from Ecole des Mines in France. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to speak today about patent protection and market exclusivity on pharmaceuticals in Europe. This is not a real paper in the sense that it's not finished, but just to give you a bit of background, I started this because I was at a conference at NYU's law school, also on pharmaceutical competition and innovation, generics, et cetera. And was talking with a couple of people who just published a piece in the Journal of Economic Perspectives as a summary of what's happened in the US after 40 years of an important piece of legislation there. And so we were having this conversation and realized that Europe is right now also undergoing some reforms in pharmaceuticals, and we don't have the comparable body of work looking at how patent protection and market exclusivity is played out. So that's the background. As you're probably aware, patent protection is fixed at 20 years in most countries, and that's regardless of the field of technology. That's not ideal in pharmaceuticals because development times tend to be very long. So while the patent clock has started to tick, firms are running clinical trials and doing other aspects of development. And during that time, they're losing this potential for exploiting the patent. For that reason, many countries provide additional protection mechanisms beyond the first patent that firms apply for when they start development. So that can take the form of extending patents or providing other regulatory exclusivity. So in the US, as I mentioned, this is called the Hatch-Waxman Act. It was passed in 1984, so we're 40 years later. This act explicitly tries to balance, it has a longer title, which is something like the Drug Price Competition and Innovation Restoration Act or something like that. It's explicitly trying to do two things: to provide incentives for innovation as well as encourage generic competition. So to do that, it provided 5 years of data exclusivity for new chemical entities. So during those 5 years, no generic can rely on the clinical data provided by the originator firm. It also provided for patent term extensions. So firms designate patents that are relevant to their drugs, and they can extend those patents by a certain amount of time. Hatch-Waxman also streamlined the approval process for generics to try and make it easier for them to get into the market as quickly as possible. And importantly, it created an incentive to challenge patents that are listed by originator firms in what's called the Orange Book. So if you've ever heard reference to a paragraph 4 challenge, that's what it is referring to. Generic firms that successfully challenge, the first generic firm to successfully challenge a patent listed in the Orange Book gets 6 months on its own as the only generic in the market. Okay, so it's a big prize for successfully challenging a patent. Biologics later were covered under a different act. They get much longer periods of exclusivity, and there's no equivalent of the Orange Book. So as we all know, generic competition is really important for containing pharmaceutical spending over time and for incentivizing innovation. And there's been concern both in the US as well as Europe about the patent system not working as it was originally intended. So in particular, the tendency of branded firms to apply for many patents on a single drug, many of which have expiration dates which are well beyond what the initial expiration date of the basic patent was. So you might have heard reference to evergreening or product hopping, or heard of pay for delay or reverse payments. All of these are related to the use of secondary patents in general. So not the first patent that covers the molecule, but lots of other patents on other aspects of the drug. So Bhavin Sampath and Scott Hemphill, with whom I was speaking last fall, they have a number of papers that have looked at this over time and a summary of the last 40 years that nevertheless shows that despite all of that activity, despite an increase in patenting and an increase in pay for delay, et cetera. Effective market life, so the realized period of exclusivity in the US has remained around 11 or 12 years, okay, for non-biologics. Okay? So if this is a chart from their paper, you can see the difference between the nominal patent term, which would be looking at the expiration date of the last expiring patent that's listed in the Orange Book, and the effective patent term, or the effective period of exclusivity. There's a big gap between those. Okay? And so what's going on there is that, in general, generic firms are challenging those secondary patents, and they are successfully entering the market well before all the secondary patents have expired. So that's the US context. As you know, Europe has a number of important differences. Before I get to the legal differences around exclusivity, just as background, the US does not have as much public provision of health insurance. There is some, but it's not as broad as it is in Europe. And in general, US consumers do more cost sharing. Okay, so they pay more out of pocket. Overall in Europe, there's lower spending on healthcare, but something that I think is unappreciated by certainly many of the policy makers who are currently thinking about this, pharmaceuticals are actually a greater share of the healthcare budget in Europe. So the US is an outlier in how much it spends. So this is healthcare spending as a percent of GDP. The black line is the US. You can see it's well above, I picked 3 European countries here. But if you look at pharmaceutical spending as a share of healthcare spending, in fact, the US is low compared to the other countries. And even though we hear a lot about high drug prices, you know, the trend, one way of interpreting this is the prices of drugs have not been going up as fast as the price of all other aspects of healthcare. Another important difference, as you're, again, probably already aware, but pharmaceutical markets in Europe generally have lower prices on branded pharmaceuticals compared to the US. That's due at least in part to the fact that European governments negotiate the price with originators, so they're exercising bargaining power. Generic competition is less intense in Europe overall, and in fact, if you compare prices of generic drugs in Europe versus the US, the European prices are higher. Okay? It's also a fragmented market because even though we're supposed to be a single market in Europe, healthcare is still a national competence, and so pricing of pharmaceuticals is still done at the local level. So this is from a recent RAND publication that has also gotten a lot of attention in the US recently because of some of Trump's proposals to control prices. So what Trump and others are complaining about is the fact that the US pays the ratio of, US prices to other country prices is 422% on average, okay, for branded pharmaceuticals. So paying a lot more than France, a lot more than Germany, et cetera. But if you look at generics, actually the US pays lower prices. Okay. So that suggests, originators are making a lot more money in the US. Generic competition seems to be pretty intense. Okay? And maybe there's a link between those two because if you have really high profitable markets, once the patent barriers fall, there's a big incentive to enter and compete those prices down. Okay, so in terms of the exclusivity that Europe provides, so this is the sort of equivalent of Hatch-Waxman in Europe. This was introduced in 2005. Up until that point, different countries provided different periods of exclusivity. Most countries provided 6 years, so again, in the US it's 5. A few countries, including France and Britain, provided 10 years. Okay. That was harmonized in 2005, so now all European countries are on the 8+2+1 system. So you get 8 years of data exclusivity, plus an additional 2 years of market exclusivity, plus potentially an additional year if a new use of the drug is developed, okay, under certain conditions. There are other protections for orphan drugs and pediatric use marketing authorizations, et cetera, that I won't go into detail on. Europe does not technically have patent extensions like the Hatch-Waxman, but it does have something called a supplementary protection certificate. This is an independent IP right. It's separate from the patent, but it's linked to a patent. It's also country specific because until very recently, there was no unitary European patent. So patent protection is done at the country level. I mean, there's a European patent office, so the patent should look the same, but firms, inventors designate which states they want protection in, and enforcement is at the country level. And supplementary protection certificates are also at the country level. The duration of the supplementary protection certificate, or how much extra time it gives an originator, is based on the application date of the basic patent, which is not necessarily easy to identify, and the marketing authorization date in the EU, or European Economic Group, so Norway and Switzerland are in there too. It gets you up to 5 years of additional protection, but no more than 15 years of total protection on the market. And potentially you can get another 6 months for pediatric trials. So to summarize, this is what protection looks like in Europe. There's a floor of 10 years provided by everybody, okay, regardless of patent status. If the drug went through development very, very quickly, you get almost all of your patent term, so potentially more. And if your drug is sort of in the middle there, you can apply for a supplementary protection certificate and push it up to at most 15 years. Okay? But it's, I would argue, a fairly generous system in Europe of various forms of legal protections for pharmaceuticals, for new drugs. So the comparison between the US and Europe, as I said, Europe tends to be more generous. The other key difference for my purposes today is that in the US, there is this Orange Book, which links patents specifically to the drugs that are approved. Okay? That does not exist in Europe. Okay? And in the US, there is this incentive to challenge patents that are listed in the Orange Book. And in Europe, there is no incentive for generics to challenge those patents. And one of the reasons that the US provides that incentive is that otherwise, a generic that challenges a patent and gets a patent invalidated is providing a public good for all other generic firms, right? It's removing that potential barrier to entry, not only for itself, but for other firms. So you might worry about the under-provision of challenges in that situation. So generic entry, therefore, faces a sort of different landscape than what is the case in the US. So not only is there not the incentive to challenge patents, and it's also maybe harder to identify where the patent barriers are. There's variation in protection across countries, and there's a lack of transparency regarding SPCs. And even if an SPC exists only in a few countries, so maybe protection has expired in one country but is still under an SPC in another country, for a generic firm that's considering entering the market, that might be a problem, because you might prefer to be able to launch everywhere and not just in the one country that doesn't have the SPC. In addition, relatively low branded prices could make entry less attractive in general, and there's not necessarily a first mover kind of equivalent or incentive that we have as in the US. Okay, so I have spent far more time than I anticipated pulling together the data for this. Certain things are very easy to find and others require a bit more work. So for exclusivity terms in particular, you have to go to the PDF documents that the EMA provides for the drugs it's approved and look through the discussion for key phrases that indicate whether the EMA has designated a new use of the drug as having sufficient therapeutic contribution that it merits this extra +1 term. Okay. There are other EMA pages where you can find information about the pediatric use marketing authorizations and other pediatric incentives, et cetera. But it is all in PDF documents, not in standard form, and what's reported changes from year to year. So it's a bit of a nuisance. I would argue that's something that could be streamlined a little bit. The other challenge is with patents. So because there's no patent linkage in the EU, you have to figure out what patents are relevant for any particular drug. I'm going to cheat in a way and use the Orange Book from the US because there's a lot of overlap between the two markets. The downside of doing that is that the Orange Book does not include biologics. Okay, so it's only small molecule drugs. And firms are strategic in what they list in the Orange Book. So that's not an exhaustive list of all patents, either in the US or necessarily in Europe. But I start with that and find all of the European equivalents to the patents listed in the Orange Book to get information on which countries were designated for protection, oppositions, whether the patent application was withdrawn, et cetera. And SPCs also turn out to be something of a nightmare to track down. They're inconsistently reported by countries, but the way that I've done it for today is to look for mentions of SPCs in the legal information provided by the EPO. So it might not, just as a caveat for when I talk about SPCs, I might not have all of them, okay, because they're sort of difficult to find. I also need entry dates for centrally approved products, so those that are approved by the EMA. You get the marketing authorization date, both for originators and for generics that use that procedure. For those that did not use the EMA, so they went through the mutual recognition procedure or decentralized procedure, there is a website that has a lot of approval dates, but it's inconsistent and it doesn't go far enough back in time. Okay, so it's hard to find the first approval of an original product in that product index. And even if you have the marketing authorization date, that doesn't necessarily mean that a product was launched in a country. So the only non-public data that I'm using today comes from IQVIA Midas, which gives me sales data at the country level. And for that, I only have 23 European countries. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a sample of drugs, which I started with those drugs designated as new molecular entities by the US Food and Drug Administration that were launched in the US between 1995 and 2023. And then I find their European equivalents. For the patent analysis, I have to use the subset that have Orange Book patents and find the patent equivalents in Europe. So I'm not looking at biologics, and there's a few drugs that are launched only in Europe that I don't have patent information on. A few drugs that were launched only in the US, so the European outcomes are not relevant, and I'm not going to consider the pediatric use marketing authorizations because those are not considered NMEs or new molecular entities. Okay. For what I talk about to follow, just to be clear on how I'm defining certain terms, the nominal patent term refers to the number of years between the first EU marketing authorization and the expiration of the last patent. Okay. The expiration of the last patent that is an equivalent of a US Orange Book patent. The basic patent term is a bit harder for me because there's no flag that says this is the basic patent. The way that I am approaching this is to assume that an Orange Book patent that has a drug product or drug substance claim is probably the basic patent. So I take the European equivalent of those patents and call that the basic patent. Trial duration is the time elapsed between the basic patent application and the first marketing authorization. And because I'm not totally sure about the basic patent application, this is subject to measurement error. And the effective market life I'm defining in the same way that Hemphill and Sampat did, which is the years between the branded launch and the first generic. And I'll do that both at the EU level, where I look at the first originator anywhere in Europe and the first generic anywhere in Europe, as well as at the country level, because those can often differ. Okay, so one point to realize is that the originators don't launch in every market. So I have launch data for 23 countries, but you can see that these lines don't go all the way up to 23. And in particular, if I focus on launches that take place relatively rapidly, so within 2 years of the initial EU authorization, only about half of them are getting, only about half the countries in my sample are getting those drugs. Okay, so the rollout is slow, and I would have expected the trend to be continuing up after the establishment of the EMA and streamlining regulation, but it's actually trending a bit down in recent years. That's not because firms don't have patent protection there, so actually they have been increasing the number of states that they seek protection in. Okay? If you look at the expiration of the basic patent. Okay, so how much time is remaining on the basic patent, if I've identified it correctly, once a drug gets to market, it has been trending a bit down over time, and you can see that it's often well below 10 years. At least the range can be well below 10 years. This is the difference between the basic patent and the nominal patent term. So as in the US, the secondary patents potentially add on a lot of extra protection. Okay? But many of those patents actually don't get renewed to the full 20 years. So especially outside of the large markets, there's a lot that are allowed to lapse early. Okay? Another point to realize is that even though there's no incentive, like paragraph 4, to challenge patents, it does happen anyway in the European system. And in particular, the stronger patents that have a drug substance or drug product claim, they're very unlikely to be opposed or rejected. But the others, which are the weaker secondary patents, they face much higher rates of opposition and rejection. So while the US system uses generic firms to challenge under this paragraph 4 incentive, the cleaning up of secondary patents seems to happen in Europe even without that. Okay, a lot of variation across countries in how often they're designated as a state that the patent will hold in, a lot of variation in SPCs, a lot of variation in how many patents are allowed to lapse early. So this is effective market life at the EU level. So it's been, other than the first few years, pretty stable and not very different from what you see in the US. Okay? So even though the legal protections are in general much more generous, the result is not that different from what we observe in the US. If you look at that at the country level, you see more variation, so it tends to be a little bit higher overall, looking at countries. This is going to be difficult for you to interpret, but basically, these dots correspond to how much patent term would be remaining, so trial duration on the x-axis, and effective market life on the y. The purple dots correspond to the original EU member states, and you can see almost all of them are above that 10-year minimum, so protection is pretty good in the larger member states. Those that were added to the EU over time, they came in with weaker protection, and you see that in the fact that they have lower effective market life terms. This is the ratio of how much of effective market life to total protection available. So if everything were working perfectly, this should be at 1, right? That originators fully exploit the protection that they get, and generics enter immediately. And you can see that that's not what happens, right? So everything to the left of 1 reflects originators not launching right away. Okay, so they're giving up that, while the patent clock is ticking, they're giving that up for reasons that have been discussed by a number of us working in this area. Everything to the right of 1 represents generic delays. And again, to give you an idea of how that varies across countries, countries like Germany, Great Britain, France tend to get most drugs, but with varying delays. So Germany gets things very quickly. France, despite its size, has more significant delays. Smaller countries like Bulgaria wait a lot longer to get the original product. Then the rate of generic entry is also lower, and the speed of generic entry also varies quite a lot. Okay? So you can see that there's still enormous heterogeneity across different European markets. Okay? So as in the US, the basic patent term has been declining over time, and these minimum regulatory exclusivity periods that helps to offset that and correct for distorted incentives. The secondary patents, this was interesting to me, they seem to play a smaller role overall in the EU because they're rejected or withdrawn or lapse. Despite these differences in how exclusivity is granted between the US and Europe, it's pretty similar, conditional on generic entry. Okay, especially in the larger EU countries. But clearly the incentives both for originator launch and generic launch could be improved. So I'm wrapping up very quickly just to tee off the fact that Europe is now discussing pharmaceutical reform. This was what the Commission proposed a couple of years ago. It was basically trying to claw back some of the data exclusivity, so dropping it from 8 years to 6 years and making some of the additional years of market exclusivity conditional on launch launch everywhere pretty quickly, basically. But this has been negotiated. I think the industry lobby has been fairly successful in persuading at least some members in Brussels that data exclusivity is very important. So we'll see how this plays out. But the Commission, Parliament, and Council have varying positions on this at the moment. There's also the introduction now of the unitary patent with the possibility of a unitary SPC. So maybe in another 20 years, everything will look very different. But that's all I have to say for today.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Thank you very much, Margaret. Very interesting presentation. I just have one quick question. From your point of view, the question is, what can we learn here in Europe from the paragraph 4 challenges? Because in the US, what we see is that some sort of cherry picking. In some sense, firms quickly rally to challenge those blockbuster drugs that are being sold quite fast. And my question is, given your analysis, do you think that here, in other words, do we need ways here in Europe to encourage more generic entry and to give generic entrants faster ways of entering the market rather than protecting the drug for 10 or whatever years they are? And thank you very much.
So I think more work needs to be done on this, but I guess my point would be, I don't think it's patent barriers that are serving as the big problem for generics. Because there's lots of countries where the patent isn't there and they still don't enter, right? I think it's the fact that it's a fragmented market with fragmented IP, which could be changing now because there should be the greater use of unitary patents and SPCs. And that I don't think Europe needs the incentives to challenge patents, because I think the EPO actually does a pretty good job getting rid of the more egregious applications. But it's for a generic thinking about entering the European market, you don't have the same kind of first mover advantage. So generics that enter in the US, they count on that 6 months to make the money, because the price is only a little bit below the originator price, which is really high, right? And then they make a killing on 6 months. In Europe, you're starting with lower prices, and a generic is not going to get the same kind of market share for that 6 months of exclusivity, because that doesn't exist. So I think that's where Europe could work a little bit, but it's hard given the fact that the markets still are fragmented. So.
There's a question in the middle there. Well, I don't think it matters. We've got time for 2 questions.
Very quick question about one of the points that you made, that in some of the markets, they're not launching the drug, some of the national markets. What's the reason for that? And if you can also clarify your histogram, that on the left side, you said are the ones which have passed the tests, have created that thresholds, but are still not launching the drug at all?
So launch delays, so I've written about this, Luca Maini and Fabio Pomoli have written about this, Pierre has written a more recent paper looking at how a similar policy would apply if the US were to adopt it. A lot of it is driven by the fact that when prices are negotiated with governments, they want to reference the price in other markets. And so that creates an incentive to avoid the markets where prices are going to be very low. Yeah. And so, yeah, they'll give up Romania, right? Because if launching in Romania means that they take a hit on profits everywhere else in Europe, it's not big enough to merit that. So, and it is pretty significant. And of course, there are launch delays also just from the fact that it takes time to negotiate these prices. So some countries do that in a more quickly than others, right? And so then that reflects, you see that also.
Can I ask the questioners? It's really hard to hear on the platform what the questions are. So if you could speak slowly, and not hold the mic too close to your mouth. We might be able to hear a bit more. Thank you. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, my question was exactly about this point, because we do have a significant difference in price levels in different countries, partly depending on income, partly depending on the regulatory system and so on. It was actually the interesting thing at a certain point, we had an internal discussion about how to pursue kind of one of those single market reselling. And the argument I made was, do you really want to impose uniform prices if it's low in Bulgaria and high in low in Bulgaria and high in Germany, in order to bring it mostly up to the German price, because the market is so much bigger. And so the MFNs that you basically have essentially the same effect. And one of the questions is that something where one should be changing policy, and that might have a big effect given what you're seeing in the data?
So I personally don't think uniform pricing would be the right answer in the European context at this point, because the health systems are so different. I mean, it's for the same reason that I think some of the comparisons between the US prices and European prices are somewhat unfair, because everything is more expensive in the US. And pharmaceuticals are just one input, and we shouldn't necessarily expect the prices of every input to be the same in every country if they're not using the same production function. So I would be very hesitant to suggest that we should have a uniform originator price in Europe. But to the extent that we can make it more of a single market for generics to justify the fixed costs of doing the engineering and getting the product, maybe there's something more that could be done there. At least it is now useful that there's the EMA for the generic approvals, because before that it was also more complicated to access all of the different country markets if they wanted to. Now at least if they go through the EMA, they have the authorization. Now, if they don't find it profitable to launch in all of them, that's a different policy lever, I guess.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret. Pierre.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to present this paper. This is a paper with Ariel Pecus, and I do not quote empirical results because we have very strong effects you will see at the end, and I'm not sure they will survive the revision we are doing currently. So this paper is about pharmaceutical advertising, and as soon as you want to study advertising, you need to consider dynamics. Why dynamics? Because advertising affects consumers, in the case of drugs, going to affect the behavior of physicians in a way which has long-term effects. So it's not going to just affect the behavior of people who are using the products in a short run. And of course, the firms know that. The firms are going to be forward-looking and anticipate the dynamic effects. And in that case, you need to consider dynamic competition. And that's what we want to do here in this paper. And what we wanted to study, and the motivation is coming from the comparison of the US with the rest of the world, is the role of direct-to-consumer advertising in the US. So the US is one of the rare countries that does direct-to-consumer advertising. You have a lot on television. And it's also, as you know, the biggest market for pharmaceuticals. So it's quite important for future innovation to know how profits in the US are affected by advertising, because we know that profits generate innovation in the future. And so the specific regulatory rules with respect to advertising in the US is quite important, not only for the US, but also for innovation in the long run. So of course, we are not going to look at the impact of advertising on innovation, but at first we wanted to study what's the impact of advertising on revenues and profits. So of course, you have several forms of promotion advertising. You have direct-to-consumer advertising on television, which is specific in the US. But of course, you have promotion everywhere in all countries towards physicians, where you want to inform physicians about the existence of new treatments, their side effects, their benefits, etc. And in general, this type of information is useful. So what we wanted to be able to evaluate is what would be a change in the regulatory rule in the US. So of course, if you, for example, you ban direct-to-consumer advertising, there will not be any more. But it's very likely that the firms are going to change their promotion strategy towards physicians. And it's not easy to know what will be the change. Direct-to-consumer advertising, so there are discussions over whether it's good or not. Okay, you can find arguments in favor, you can find arguments against. The arguments against are that they are trying to incentivize the use of drugs. Here we are talking about prescription drugs, okay? And this could lead to excessive use and basically business stealing across firms. So this could be without any benefit to society and just some wasteful spending. But there are also arguments in favor, which is that they could help patients to know that there exists some treatment and then go and see their doctor and get treatments. So what we want to do here in this paper is to understand what will be the effect in equilibrium of limiting direct-to-consumer advertising. And in particular, when we think about the equilibrium, we are going to think about equilibrium effect on the other forms of advertising, which is detailing, so the advertising that you do to prescribers, to physicians. But of course, there are other equilibrium effects. We are not going to study all of them, but there are also price equilibrium effects. Potentially, there could be entry equilibrium effects, which are not going to be in our model yet. But once you have that, then you can determine what's the impact on profit, what's the impact on total demand, and whether this differs across markets, because there may be differences. And so to do this, as I said, you need a dynamic model, because you need to introduce the fact that advertising affects not only the demand today, but also in the future. And here we are on markets where you have several firms that potentially provide some drug treatment for a condition. So basically they compete for the patients, and so it's going to be a dynamic game, because the firms want to maximize profit, but of course they are in competition with other firms. This type of dynamic game is notoriously complicated to model, and we are going to provide a method to do that. So I will try to explain in very simple terms the method. The data we use are data on revenues and quantities for the US by drug on the period 2002-2014. And we also have advertising expenditure in the different forms of advertising, but basically the two most important are detailing, so the advertising to physicians, and direct-to-consumer advertising, which is mostly television advertising. And we have that by drug, by quarter over the period 2005-2014. And finally, we also use medical expenditure panel survey data to determine the potential market. So we want to know, when we look at, for example, cholesterol, how many potential users of anti-cholesterol drugs there are at a given time in the US. And we didn't want to rely on functional forms, on the structural models that we develop to get that. Okay. Just to give you a few descriptive statistics, we are going to study 4 markets. Why? Because during the time period of the data that we have, these are the 4 markets that do the most advertising. If you do the same statistics today, you will get different markets, because this is depending a lot on which drugs are on patent, which drugs have exclusivity, because there is very little advertising of generics. And so, of course, this changes over time, and so cholesterol probably now has much less advertising because most of the drugs are generic. But at that time, cholesterol was advertising a lot, and you see the total advertising per product per quarter in thousands of dollars. What you see is that the top 4 advertisers advertise much more, so there is, of course, a lot of heterogeneity across drugs. And in general, they do also a lot of DTC advertising, direct-to-consumer advertising, even if a bit less than detailing. What is interesting is that if you look per drug at those statistics, you will find that you never do DTC advertising without doing detailing, while the reverse could happen. So we are going to have a model that tries to model this and try to generate, in a counterfactual situation, what would happen if you ban direct-to-consumer advertising. And so if you have this DTC advertising going to zero by regulation, by how much the detailing is going to change, okay? This is a graph that shows for each product on the horizontal axis the direct-to-consumer advertising expenditure in log terms. On the vertical axis, the detailing in log terms, and the dot is a product. The colors are for the different markets. What you see is that when they both advertise, there is a positive correlation between the two. But there are also some drugs that don't do direct-to-consumer advertising. And then you have many dots on the vertical line on the left. And instead of showing you all those many dots, I show you the density distribution of those dots on the left axis. And what you see is that in general, when they don't do direct-to-consumer advertising, they still do substantial detailing, but sometimes they don't. Okay, you have a mass at zero. But when they do, they still do quite substantially, even if less than what they would do if they were for those that do also direct-to-consumer advertising. So the modeling issues is important here because it's quite difficult to model the dynamic behavior of firms in this game structure. Okay, where I have a branded drug for cholesterol, I have a competing branded drug for this cholesterol, and so I'm going to advertise today to get some more patients, and I have these two forms of advertising to consumers on television or to physicians with this detailing, but my competitor can do the same, and I anticipate that what I do today is going to affect the demand today, but also in the future, because physicians and patients are going to remember the ads they have seen, or they are going to remember the promotions they have been exposed to. So that's very difficult to model. In the literature, in empirical I/O, the methodology to do this type of dynamic game has been developed by my co-author with other co-authors, Ariel Pecus with many others. And the seminal paper in this literature was Erickson-Pecus 95. But there are not so many applications in contexts where you have many firms and many products. So usually the applications of these dynamic games are in very simple contexts where you have two firms or just two products. So you look for example, at the Coca-Cola and Pepsi competition or these type of things, because you have a tractability issue in terms of numerical computation as soon as the number of firms is too big or as soon as the number of products is too big. So here we are clearly in the context where it's impossible to apply those methodology. Numerically, it's not tractable because we have too many firms competing. So typically in the anti-cholesterol drugs, you will have 30 different products when you include the generics during that time period, and maybe as many firms. And it's impossible to use this concept of game. So what we did here is to use another concept, and basically this is driven by the fact that if economists are not able, and in particular Ariel Pecus, who is at the frontier of this methodology, is not able to compute those equilibria with this methodology, it's very unlikely that firms do that. And so we are going to use another concept which is more realistic, which is also much simpler, but has not been applied yet because there was a lack of empirical methods for that. That's what we are going to develop. So for that, we develop an empirical model and equilibrium model. The equilibrium model theory is going to be based on what they call the experience-based equilibrium instead of Markov-perfect perfect equilibria. And I'm going to explain what is experience-based equilibrium in one slide. In the empirical part, we are going to do very simple assumptions. We are going to assume that the firms maximize their expected discounted value of future profits. And we are going to assume that their perceptions of the future is something that you can obtain, you can reveal from their behavior in the data. So you can observe what they do, how much they advertise, depending on the prices of drugs, the number of competitors, and many characteristics of the market. And we are going to develop an empirical model that is based on this empirical behavior, without making any assumption of rationality or equilibrium assumption. Of course, to have something realistic, you need to allow the fact that the firms may base their decision on things that we as economists don't observe. So we don't observe all the parameters that affect their decision that the managers of advertising campaign decide on. So for that, we need to have some unobservables that affect this behavior. And this unobservable, of course, needs to be potentially serially correlated. Because there are things that repeat over time and that may affect the behavior of firms. Once we determine this from the data, we are going to use this as state variables and try to add an equilibrium condition and try to see how the firms are far from this concept of experience-based equilibrium, where basically the experience-based equilibrium says that the behavior of firms has to be consistent with the probability of each outcome given the state that they have observed in the past and that they observe in the data. Okay, I'll skip this. And so I go here to the equilibrium concept in one slide. So what we do is a bit more complicated than this because we have two advertising decisions, the detailing and the direct-to-consumer advertising on television. But here we can understand the equilibrium concept just with one dynamic variable, which is the advertising. So let's assume there is just one. So for product J, you decide how much you want to advertise at period T. This AJT may depend on things that we observe as economists and also that the firm observe, but also other variables that the firm know, but that we don't observe. The things that the firms observe and we also observe are the X. The things that the firms know and that we don't know are the omega, okay, and theta parameters. So that's the decision, the policy function. Okay, and the first thing we are going to do is determine empirically from the data, because in the data we observe many X, we observe A, and we are going to determine this policy function from the data, from the behavior of firms that we observe, okay, without making any assumption on the optimality of this behavior. So imagine that we can do this first step, we can recover this functional form of the fact that there is a patent expiration, the fact that you have a new competitor, a new generic drug, the fact that another branded drug has a price increase. All these things are going to affect my policy and how much I advertise, the fact that my competitor advertise a lot, etc. All this is in the A function. Okay? It determines empirically how the firms decide, and we recover this from the data. Once you have that, you could say, okay, what should be the discounted sum of profit of the firm if the firm believes that this policy function is going to be the one that everybody plays in the future and that my competitor plays. So if that is the case, then the profit I get is the profit that I had for product J at period T given this advertising minus the advertising expenditure, plus the expected value of the discounted sum of future profits that, of course, depend on the AJT, because the AJT affects demand shocks. The Xi here are future demand shocks. They affect the way the consumers, the physicians are going to prescribe, which affects profits in the future, which affects also the perception of the competitors that enter the policy decision next period. That's why it affects the AJT plus 1. Okay? But once you know this function A, you can compute this. Now what we are going to do is to say, okay, in which case this A is an equilibrium of the experience-based equilibrium. So what we are going to do is to say, let's compute what should be the optimal advertising if you maximize this discounted sum, expected discounted sum of profit, which is a solution of this first order condition here. If you're going to find the optimal decision, and now what we are going to say is that, okay, we can compare the policy decision with the equilibrium decision, but then we can also say, okay, what are the theta parameters of this policy function that makes the policy equal to this optimal decision? If we find them, then we have an equilibrium, which is the equilibrium, the experience-based equilibrium concept. Okay, so that's what we are going to do, and the advantage of this. Of course, we can do this with 2A, the detailing and the DTC. The advantage of this is that now we can do a counterfactual and say what would happen in terms of behavior of the firm if we stop direct-to-consumer advertising. So we have two, first, a model that allows us to recover the policy function and also marginal cost of products, etc., all the parameters that enter the profit function. And then we can also compute the equilibrium. Okay, so the way we are going to implement this, and I will skip a lot of details, is that there are going to be several steps. The first step is to estimate the demand shape. We want to recover what's the aggregate on the aggregate for the US, what's the demand of each of the branded and generic products, given their price, given advertising. And we are going to do this in two steps. First, it's a traditional Berry-Levinson-Pecos demand system, so very flexible demand system that allows to have not to put too many constraints on cross-price elasticities, for example. But then also add to this a controlled Markov process for the evolution of the unobservable shocks of demand according to advertising. So basically, this is the part where we recover how advertising affects demand. Okay? And once we have that, we are going to formulate a policy model for the advertising decision of the firm. Once we have that, we introduce the equilibrium framework, the one that I just shown the slide before, recover the equilibrium, and then we can do counterfactuals. So I will skip details about the demand model and the evolution of the Markov process and the way advertising affects demand. What is important is that at the end we get demand parameters that look very intuitive with price coefficients that are negative, etc. But also we get something that appears to be very important, which is that indeed advertising has some long-lasting effect, and you can see that from the first row, the Xt-1 parameters. Okay, they are going to be the serial correlation in the demand that come from the fact that advertising affects this unobservable. Okay, so the fact that they are very significant and positive means that when you advertise today, you are going to affect the future in the long term. The second parameter that you have also in blue is the impact of advertising expenditure on this Xi, and it's also positive as we could anticipate, meaning that advertising affects positively the demand. We did a lot of specification search, so one thing which is very important here is that at the end, what appears important is that the two forms of advertising are complement. So when you advertise on detailing or when you advertise on direct-to-consumer advertising, you have complementarity in the profit. And this is not driven by the functional form, because we added some terms in order to allow something that would not be complement, and this was rejected. So we have this complementarity, and you can anticipate that when you will ban direct-to-consumer advertising, then possibly you're going to have a decrease in the detailing expenditure because of the complementarity that is now missing. Okay, I skip also the empirical models, the way we determine the policy function. Okay, and the estimation method. At the end, we have an algorithm to estimate, and this is the part which is the most sensitive part of all the estimation method. Not the most time-consuming, but the most sensitive, because it relies on instrumental variables, and we know that GMM method with IV are always quite sensitive. But basically what is nice is that we have a method to recover, and you can see it from the inner loop part of the algorithm. Okay, so basically here you have something, a policy function. The V bar is a policy function. The AH is one form of advertising. H is for detailing or DTC. And basically you have something that tells you what should be the advertising with some unobservable due to selection, but let's forget that. That's what's the first order condition that should be satisfied in the long run if the firm choose advertising correctly. And we can use this to recover CJ, which is the marginal cost of the drug J, without any assumption on the price optimality. So that's very nice, because we have data for the US where what we have in terms of price is an aggregate average price for the US. So it's total revenue divided by total quantity. And we know that the prices are very different across PBM, across different purchaser of the drugs. And so it's unlikely that all the first order conditions that the price are satisfying for each of the purchaser are aggregating into a nice first order condition for the whole US. So without any assumption on the price first order condition, we can still recover marginal cost because of the optimality of advertising this advertising condition according to the empirical model. And that's very important because for those who have studied market power in this industry, you can see from this table the average markup for all across these 4 markets if you estimate it using the price first order condition or if you estimating using the advertising equation. And what you see is that if you estimate the price first, if you estimate those markets with price first order condition, you get much smaller markets and probably not very realistic compared to what we get with the advertising condition. So once we have that, we can compute the equilibrium. Also going to skip the equilibrium parameters. It's just an application with more details about what I have shown you at the beginning. And so we compute this experience-based equilibrium, and this converges very quickly to those parameters, and then we can do counterfactual. So I'm not going to detail all those parameters, but you have some parameters here that have the expected sign in a way. Okay, so the fact that when the patent expiration is coming closer and closer, in general, what you find in the empirical model and also in equilibrium is that firms advertise less and less. What is nice is that once you have these parameters of the equilibrium, you can simulate the equilibrium detailing and DTC decision in the statu quo condition. And so the blue dots are what I have shown you before, except that I don't distinguish the 4 markets, and the red dots are the simulated expenditures. Of course, it's not exactly the same because you have some shocks, some unobservable, but what you recover is this positive correlation, as well as the density of what you should do when you don't do direct-to-consumer advertising. And then we do the counterfactual, and these are the numbers we find. So in the new estimates that are going on and for which we don't have yet the table here, well, we find smaller impact. And that's my conclusion. So what is interesting is that what we find is that if you ban direct-to-consumer advertising, you see the detailing going down quite strongly, which is coming from this complementarity that we found in the demand, in addition to the dynamic effects. But also profits go down, and it's net profits. So net of how much you save by not spending on television advertising. And that's I think I'm over time, so I'm going to stop here. So basically what we find is that direct-to-consumer advertising seems to have an impact. If you ban it, you will not only have less advertising on television, of course, but also less detailing, which in the end has some impact on the number of patients that are going to purchase the drugs. And this impact is differential across the markets. And we understand the differences across the markets because there are differences in terms of symptoms of the condition. So if you have asthma, you don't really need to be advertised a lot to understand you have a problem. While if you have too high cholesterol, you don't have symptoms, and so advertising is more important in that case. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a couple of questions. Peter's saying only 1, but I think we could 2 questions I'm allowed. Yes, 2. So we have time for 2 questions. Who would like to ask a question? There's 2 at the front here.
Thank you, Pierre, for the presentation. So I was trying to figure out that a lot of the literature says that this advertising has waves in terms of when firms start to doing a lot of physician detailing, at least, not necessarily the DTC part, which is typically before the expiration of the patent or something like that, or end of market exclusivity, at least, of some form or the other. Is that somehow in the dynamic model accounted for when the timing is going on? And how is it affecting it?
Yeah, so I hope I understood correctly your question. So you're talking about the timing of advertising and the fact there are waves
Yeah, real in the sense that usually it's just before the end of market
Yeah,
exclusivity.
that's exactly.
And then it starts tapering down.
Maybe can I
That's
just
what
add
we
to this?
find, yeah.
Yeah. In the model that I saw for the profits, it seemed like the terms going forwards didn't have an end, but they might end variably depending on where you are in the process for a particular drug.
Yeah, so there are two points. So what is nice with this what is difficult with these dynamic models is to have some models that is going to be able to replicate what you see, like phenomena like the one you say, like corner solution, etc. And what is nice is that our model allows that. And so we are able to and indeed I've shown very quickly that we're able to, in the statu quo case, when we simulate the equilibrium, we recover the same density of detailing when you don't do DTC, so which is a corner solution for one of the two variables. We also find the same effect of the duration until patent expiration, and the fact that indeed advertising decreases with this duration. For the profit, so we have something that I didn't show. We need to specify a discount factor. And what we find is that the discount factor you need for the firms to rationalize the advertising they do, you need a small beta, a large discount if you want, which is unusually large compared to the interest rate, for example. And there is if you talk to the industry, they are not surprised. They say, yeah, we don't make plans until like 50 years. We make plans for 3 years, 6 years. And so this is probably the reason for which we find these betas that are much less smaller than 1. And there is a recent AER paper just published last month, maybe, that made a survey about all the many industries in the US and trying to characterize the discount factor of firms in those industries, and that shows that they are discounting much more than what they should if they were using the risk-free interest rate, and that this discount factor is also. They discount more in industries where you have market power, which is typically the case for pharmaceuticals.
Thank you, Pierre. And thank you for the questions. I think we should move on and thank Pierre again. And Florian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carol. Hello, everybody. I'm still in Pierre's slides.
These are additional slides.
Oh, no, now I'm way ahead in mine. Okay, here we are. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for having me here. I'm going to continue to bother with you with pharmaceutical markets. This is joint work with Klaus Kugler and Lukas Pirnbacher, who are also at Vienna University of Economics and Business. And we are currently in the process of revising this paper. So all comments on particularly the empirical approach are highly appreciated. In this project, we're going to zoom in on the relationship on market power and regulation. So specifically, we're going to look at changes in ownership induced through mergers and how the effects of those are mitigated by regulation, the presence or the absence of regulation. And our laboratory is going to be the Austrian market for pharmaceuticals. I'm going to be brief on the motivation of why this matters, but essentially we've seen lots of M&A going on in pharmaceutical markets, and they are regulated and complex, so it's not obvious how consumers are going to be impacted by these changes in ownership. Pharmaceutical markets in most countries contain a regulated and an unregulated segment, and the difference mainly is that in the regulated segment, the social security provider pays for you, and in the unregulated segment, you're paying a market price. Privately. Our treatments are going to be induced by mergers in the 2009 to 2017 period. Specifically, we see a population of 56 large international mergers that change ownership structures, but we're going to zoom in on those that entail changes in market power at a quite disaggregated level, at the ATC4 level. So we are going to look at overlapping mergers where the acquirer has a pre-existing product in a specific disease indication and then acquires another one such that the market share there changes. And that leads to us observing more than 400 drug ownership changes. These are essentially our main treatment group. What are we going to do with them? Well, we're going to do difference in difference estimates to see how their prices and also their product variety, which is a measure of product quality that we're going to define, change after the changes in ownership. And then we are going to illustrate our findings from this reduced form exercise in a structural model where we hope to elaborate on the mechanisms that are leading to these changes that we observe. A little bit on the literature. We are obviously not the first to study either mergers or regulation. So the price effects of mergers have been studied, well, quite extensively. Also to some degree in pharmaceutical markets, most prominently, I think, by Bjørnestad and Verboven, 2016. Also, the non-price effect of mergers have been studied, for example, the impact on product variety, Barry and Waldvogel and Fan. Product repositioning has been studied by Sweeting. And also the impact of regulation on market outcomes in pharmaceutical markets has been studied, Brandstetter et al., and also by Pierre Dubois and Laura Lazio. So what do we believe is our contribution here? Well, we are studying the impact of changes in market power and regulation jointly. And we're doing so not in a cross-country setting, but we are doing it within a country and within medical indication to some degree. So we observe the same drugs being sold under regulation and without regulation. So what we claim we do is that we are able to have a unified laboratory, so to say, that we can speak about market power regulation within one setting. In case I don't make it to the end, there's a very strict time discipline here. I'm going to summarize my results here. We're going to find that prices increase after mergers. That is not particularly surprising. In the absence of regulation, they increase by about 7% on average, but there is a large heterogeneity underlying that. Prices do not increase in the presence of regulation, which is rather comforting because our structural model is later going to show us that the regulation we look at are actually binding, so prices should not be able to increase, so it's good that they don't. And for product variety, we find decreases in both segments in the market, in the unregulated and the regulated segment, but we do find that the decrease in product variety is twice as strong in the unregulated part. Next, we're going to use the structural model to say something about what's going on there. And essentially, I will not have the time to explain to you all the details of that model, but some of the main takeaways, and I'm going to show you a few more later, are that we find that consumers in our markets, they have a high preference for variety, so they benefit in terms of their welfare if more varieties are present. And well, very unsurprisingly, they're quite price sensitive in the unregulated part of the market. That is where they have to pay themselves and privately. So there it matters more if prices change for them. We do find that price regulation is binding for almost all products that are price regulated, and we do simulate that prices would be 40% higher in absence of the price regulation. So there are significant savings generated by price regulation in Austria. And price increases also decrease consumer surplus. So obviously, consumers don't enjoy being charged higher prices. A little overview over the market we're going to study, because it's quite the specific laboratory. So it's a highly regulated market. Essentially, the entire population is covered by social insurance, which means that if you have a serious medical condition, you don't have to pay much in excess of some low fees for getting recipes, for getting the drugs. At least if you stay within the regulated segment. Regulation is quite pervasive. Two-thirds of drugs are regulated, and the price negotiation process is quite complex in the details, but in essence, it is a reference pricing approach where the people in charge of the social security regulation, they look at prices in other countries. So there, I mean, we've already heard about this entry game a little bit. So usually the drugs go to Norway and Switzerland first, and then so Austria usually is in the second tier of countries receiving them relatively quickly, but not first. A few words on drug authorization, because that's going to be relevant later on. Obviously, it's not easy to bring a new drug to the market because you have to show that the expected benefits exceed the side effects, but also that your new drug is better than existing products, otherwise it will not be refundable. And obviously that requires comprehensive clinical testing. However, if you are only wanting to introduce a new variant of an existing product, and by a variant, I'm usually talking about either a new dosage, so a stronger or a weaker dosage, or a new consumption form, so maybe a pill instead of a syringe or something like that, then that goes relatively quickly because all the tests are there already and it's essentially an administrative procedure to introduce that new variant into the market. I already talked about the mergers that we're seeing. Some of the largest that we have are Teva Allergan, Allergan and Actavis, Pfizer and Wyeth, and Merck and Schering. We're actually going to do the case study on a subsegment of the drugs affected by the Teva-Allergan merger. And I'm putting here the deal values because those deal values are bigger than the entire Austrian pharmaceutical markets by almost an order of magnitude. Therefore, we are going to assume that those deals didn't happen because of the regulation in Austria, but we're going to treat them as exogenous. We also use IMS health data. We have them for Austria at the monthly level. So we observe every drug in the market. We see prices and quantities at the monthly level. And we were also able to match a large number of covariates to those drugs because we talked to some people who are maintaining such databases. I'm going to show you some of them later. When I refer to a product, I mean the aggregation of all sizes, and that means package sizes, forms, and dosages of a drug. So we are consolidating across different variants of the drug and treating those variants as product quality to a degree. And the quantities we're going to measure in standardized units, so-called dosages, because we're going to abstract from having different package sizes in our data. So variety, which I have mentioned a couple of times now, is the total number of dosages and consumption forms available, but we do not measure different package sizes here. Yeah, just ignore that. So essentially, we're assuming that consumers have a benefit when they get a different dosage of the drug. Maybe it's more convenient to consume it only once a day rather than 3 times a day, or if there is a new consumption form that may make consumption more convenient, but a different package size we don't treat as a product innovation. Sales occur either in the regulated market, where the EU average pricing is found, and where all costs, except for a small deductible, are reimbursed by social insurance, or we see sales in the unregulated segment of the market, where consumers pay privately. But importantly, many of the drugs we observe are sold in both segments of the market. So usually it would be the case that certain package sizes are in the regulated market and certain package sizes are not in there, and we observe sales of both. And that means we see exactly the same drug being sold in exactly the same country, one time for no cost to the consumer and one time with the market price to the consumer. We're going to look at rather detailed medical areas. We can go down to the molecular level even, but we're going to stick with the ATC4 medical subgroup, which is essentially all drugs that address a specific medical indication. So those are well-defined markets. And in those markets, we observe average market shares of about 20% at the ATC4 level in regulated markets and around 25% in unregulated markets. That means in regulated markets, we see approximately 5 drugs per indication being available to consumers, whereas in unregulated markets, it's only 4 drugs. The largest players in the market we're going to look at are Novartis, Pfizer, and AstraZeneca, but you can see that they are not too dominant. So their combined market share of the 3 biggest firms is less than 25%. And I'm showing you some summary statistics here. I'm not going to make you read that, but you can see there's a lot of firms active in the market, around 300 in the first or in the second column after the years. You can see that there is around 2,000 different drugs available. You have some statistics on market shares, which approximately reflect what I just told you. And you can also see about the variety as we have defined it. So based on our definition, we have between 1.5 in the unregulated and 2 varieties on average in the regulated market segment. Here's another table that illustrates the treatments in our data. So you can see we have merger deals in every year. They have deal values. And we here have the treated products. So we arrive at the 440 products that are directly treated, where an acquirer has a pre-existing product and acquires an additional product in the same ATC4 market. And we do something very similar for the rival products. We wanted to capture strategic reactions of the rivals in that ATC4 market. And up until the previous revision, we had very nice results there. Right now, we don't find anything on rivals anymore. I was slightly concerned that my slides are a bit too formal, but after Pierre, I think I'm okay. We have a toy model that illustrates the effects we're going to, some predictions on the effects that we're expecting. Essentially, this is price setting without any regulation, so Bertrand competition as we have in the Björnerstedt and Verboven paper. The essential insight here, which is not that shocking maybe, is that if a firm acquires more drugs in the market, they have an incentive to raise prices. And the reason for that is that we have more drugs in the firm's ownership matrix, so more of the spillovers are captured by the firm itself, making it more profitable to raise prices. Yeah. And in the regulated segment, we have a very similar optimization problem, a very similar first order condition with an important difference. Namely, there is now a set of permissible prices, the EU reference prices in this capital omega. And that is very similar to the setup in Dubois and Lazio. And essentially what comes out of this is that if the prices are already binding, if regulation says you cannot increase them, well then surprisingly you will not be able to increase them. But the lambda is going to increase. The lambda is, so to say, the shadow price of regulation. So your desire to increase prices rises, but you cannot do so because the bureaucrats don't allow it. And we also have a first order condition for variety. So that is the second decision variable that firms are going to have in our structural model. They're optimizing their decisions over both the prices and the varieties they choose. And when we derive the profit function for variety, we get three terms. A marginal cost effect, a demand effect, and a cannibalization effect. And essentially, we can derive the expectation that the variety effect is going to be larger in unregulated market than in regulated markets, essentially because the markups are going, we expect the markups to be larger in unregulated markets. When firms have free price setting, they will set higher prices, ceteris paribus, therefore they will be earning more per drug sold, therefore both the demand and the cannibalization channel should be larger in the unregulated segment of the market. So we would expect a stronger impact on variety there compared to the regulated market. And finally, let me show you my diff in diff estimation equation before we head over to some results. So we're estimating difference in difference equations for both the log prices and the log varieties of a drug in a month sold by a company in either the regulated or the unregulated segment of the market. As I already said, we're going to focus on overlapping market share. So this post indicator is only going to switch to one after a drug is being acquired in a market where the acquirer already has a product. We're going to use two-way fixed effects to control for as much as we can. So we have a fixed effect at the drug company market level and a fixed effect at the time level. And in addition to that, as I mentioned before, we are able to match a large amount of drug characteristics. So we are being quite comprehensive in controlling for stuff. For example, we control for generic entry into an ATC4 market, for the age of a drug, the number of active substances, the years of shelf life, launch status, protection status, patent expiry, abuse potential, how it is being sold to consumers, cold storage, and whether it needs to be prescribed by physicians or not. Finally, we allow the standard errors to cluster at the firm level. So we assume that the firm is the decision-making entity here where errors might be correlated. And we use the Sonnen-Abraham estimator for staggered treatment adoption because, as you have seen, our treatments occur all over the place. So without further ado, this is what we find. In the first column, you have the regulated markets, and in the second column, you have the unregulated markets. In the first row, you have the impact on prices, and in the second row, you have the impact on product variety. So the first cell, the first panel of this shows you that prices in regulated markets are not affected. None of the, so these are even study graphs, right? So I didn't show you we can also split up the estimation equation into not an average treatment effect, but into period-specific treatment effects. And this is what I'm showing you here. All the impacts are insignificant on prices in the regulated markets, but on the right hand, you see that the prices increase, well, significantly in unregulated markets. The average effect is going to be around 7%, but you can see in later periods it's up to about 15%. And then in the lower two panels, you observe the changes in variety after an acquisition. And here we see negative effects in both segments. But we do see that on the right-hand side, the downward trend is much more pronounced than in the regulated market segment. So we have no price impact in regulated markets. We have price increases in unregulated markets. We have variety decreases in both segments, but they are more pronounced in the unregulated market segment. This is just the price effect of mergers disaggregated by different broad medical indications. This is just to show you that even when we look at more differentiated markets, we don't find much in terms of price changes in the regulated markets, which is the left-hand side of the panel. But in the unregulated markets, we find significant increases in multiple, but not all indications. So this overall pattern, we estimate, holds in most medical sub-indications. And if you're interested in regression coefficients, here they are. Clear 0 for regulated prices, 7% unregulated prices, and negative coefficients for both variety estimations. Here's the rivals. So this is a bit different now since the last revision. We used to find that prices were strategic complements, so the rivals would also increase their prices. We still get positive coefficients there, but they are now insignificant. And with variety, we actually get a rather large effect of the rival reaction in the unregulated market segment. So it's about the same coefficient size we see as a reduction for the acquirers, but it's imprecisely estimated and not statistically significant. So currently, we don't see many rival reactions, and that may also be related to how strongly and strictly these markets are regulated. Okay, let me come to the final part, namely the case study of the Teva-Allergan merger. It's a case study on the platelet aggregation inhibitor segment, which I know nothing about medically, but we decided to use this as a case study because it's one of the more relevant ATC4s affected by this large merger. And we also chose it for some pragmatic reasons, because in order for our illustration to make sense, we need to observe a lot of drugs both in the regulated and the unregulated part of the market. The reason being, we're going to try and recover marginal costs. And in order to recover marginal costs, we need to see them in both under regulation and also in the wild, so to say. And also in this, this deal has affected both segments of the market substantially. So it's simply a good candidate for illustration. So what do? We estimate supply side and demand side, and then we use those estimates to recover the elasticities of consumers, to test if the price constraints in the regulated market segment are binding. We're going to simulate the effects of the Teva-Allergan merger on that market, and we're going to conduct a welfare analysis. I'm going to show you the demand model, but from here on it's going to be pictures, I promise. So we're using a nested logic demand model, which is a bit out of fashion. However, we believe it's very appropriate in the context of medical indications. We do have very well-defined markets. You cannot substitute a drug for your indication with a drug from another nest. That's not how it works medically, is my understanding. We are estimating the demand segment-specific as a function of prices and varieties and market share. So this is pretty standard demand estimation. We're treating all of our right-hand side variables as endogenous. So we use the classical demand shifters such as product characteristics. And we also use the differentiation IDs from Gandhi and Hood, where we essentially count rival products in the market. So this is a standard estimation approach. So here is one thing that comes out of it. What I'm showing you here is the elasticity of consumers over time, so from 2004 to 2018, for the regulated, which is the light gray, and the unregulated market, which is the black line. We believe that this picture supports that our structural model makes a lot of sense. The reason being, we know that in 2010, the patent for the branded product Plavix, which is the main player in this market, expired. So in 2010, we see the entry of about a dozen generic drugs into the market, and you can see how strongly consumer elasticities react to that. Less so in the regulated market, which kind of makes sense because they didn't pay before, they don't pay now. So the elasticities in the regulated market likely come from physicians' incentives, who are being incentivized by Social Security to be economic with the money, but not always are. But when consumers pay privately, you can see that their willingness to pay high prices is strongly reduced after the introduction of the generics. Here you can see an exercise of simulation. Essentially, we're looking at drugs that are both sold in the regulated and unregulated segment. In the unregulated segment, we can, under some assumption, recover the marginal costs of those drugs. So we can simulate what should they cost under the market structures that we observe in the regulated part of the market. And we can see if that price is higher than the actual price we observe, the regulated price. And if that price is higher, if the simulated price is higher, we're going to say that the price constraint is binding. And the upper gray line shows you that except for the very beginning of our observation period, almost all the price constraints in the regulated market are actually binding. So they do achieve an effect. And the lower line gives you the average difference between regulated and unregulated prices, and that amounts to about 40%. So that is a substantial amount of cost savings achieved by regulation. And here you have the same graph, more or less, on a drug level basis. What this shows you is that, so this is the relative price difference between the actual price and the predicted price, the simulated price. So if we are to the right of the zero line, it means that the price constraint is binding. And what this shows you is that except for one drug, all of the price constraints are binding, and in most cases, the prices are substantially, or significantly, I should say, lower than they were in absence of regulation. And finally, here is the welfare study that I promised you. So what we're doing here is we're simulating the merger. So we're pooling the products of Teva and Allergan in this ATC4, and we're simulating the new equilibrium. And we find that in the new equilibrium, the merging firms increased their prices by close to 5%, which is about the same order of magnitude that we find in the reduced form analysis, where we find 7% price increases. And we also find that merging firms substantially, or I should say significantly, reduce their variety, although the impact here is much smaller than what we find empirically. We also get some impacts on rivals, which are not too large, which is coinciding with our empirical results on that. So yeah, by and large, we argued that our case study confirms what we have found in the reduced form estimates. So let me sum up. Summing up is that we studied the impact of mergers on prices, also quantities, which I haven't shown you anything on, and product variety in the Austrian pharmaceutical markets. We illustrate that there are both price and non-price effects, particularly on variety. Prices increase, and we show that it makes a quite substantial difference on whether a drug is price regulated or not, that difference on average being 40% of price. So the main findings are that we find increases in the prices in the unregulated segment, where firms are allowed to set their prices freely. We do not find price increases in the presence of price regulation. We find that product variety decreases in both segments of the market, but less so in the regulated part. Frankly, we need to look into this a bit more in detail. It might be simply a delay, so regulated markets react slowly, so maybe it's more that. At the end of the day, I think firms would have a strong incentive to offer the same varieties on both sides of the market, so that is something we're still looking into. But our main conclusion is that actually regulation can, to a degree, successfully mitigate the impact of market power on consumers by preventing price increases and mitigating declines in variety due to mergers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. So again, we have time for a couple of questions. There's one over there.
Thank you so much. Very interesting paper, Florian. So I have one question that comes to me in terms of regulations is, I would expect the regulation itself to change over 5 years, over a period of 3 years. You need to go back and revise, pricing.
So could you talk without the mic? I can hardly understand.
Well, people aren't like it, but if you pull the mic away. I was trying to do it. Okay, thanks. So the effect of regulations, basically, it might be that every 5 years you need to revise regulations. There are some algorithms. I don't know how it works in your data. But the other interesting part is the role of variety. Does your variety, for example, provide more people coming and getting drugs? So do you have an outside option effect, or is just the market is exactly the same, and you're simply finding, a product that is more suitable for you, for your kind of disease, So that's another thing that you can start looking, if there is any effect of this option or not. Thanks.
No, I think what you're saying is something we also investigated. So essentially, we believe that in the absence of the ability to raise prices, firms have an incentive to have additional points in the continuum of product characteristics. So if I cannot increase my price when I want to, maybe I sell another drug in that market and maybe increase my volume at least. So I think, yeah, there is a complex interaction that regulation has on prices, quantities, and product characteristics. And you're right, we should take them all into account. Yeah.
Okay, and there's another question here.
Thank you. So I found the result on variety decreasing after this thing in the regulated part and the unregulated part surprising to some extent. Well, in some ways I do expect that, yes, variety can be reduced. But in another way, when I'm thinking about the regulated sector, I would have thought that you can use variety as a way of doing some form of price discrimination. By offering different packs and different strengths and different things, launching them at different prices, because overall price is fixed in the regulated sector. But if you add a new variety or take out a new variety, then that variety can be at a different price. But you've aggregated the data all the way up to what you were defining as the product, where you're saying, I'm ignoring all that variation within the product. And that's what's making me wonder if some of this result is coming because of that aggregation, that you're losing that true variation within it, and that's hiding away the ability for the firm to do some sort of price discrimination.
Your intuition is absolutely correct. In a previous form of the paper, we reported variety increases in the regulated market, and that is because we thought that the relevant level of decision is the firm. So we counted variety at the indication level and had the fixed effects at the firm level. Then we found the firm offers more variety in an ATC4. However, referees disagreed with our modeling choices, and now we're using drug fixed effects. So we're looking only at the impact on a particular product. And in such an estimation setting, we find that the per product variety decreases. On your point about discrimination, I think that is also perfectly true. So we see that firms have a strategic incentive not to offer their drugs in the socially reimbursed sector at first. So what is happening is that there is like an intermediate box, an intermediate level of regulation where a medical professional can say, this is not yet covered by social insurance, but we need this drug, so I'm going to authorize it for reimbursement. And that is usually for very, very expensive drugs. And then firms play with this. So they know they need our new level 4 cancer drug. So we're not putting it into the regulated part of the market, because then we can charge any price that we like.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again, Florian.